Hi, welcome to Let Me Ask You Something. My name is Veen, and today we discuss the wonderful article, The Life Cycle of a Clinical Cadaver, a Practice-Based Ethnography, written by Anna MacLeod, Victoria Long, Paula Cameron, George Kovacs, Molly Verdeen, Lucy Patrick, Olga Kitts, and Jonathan Tummans. This paper is the 10th installment of the series on philosophy and medical education in the journal Teaching and Learning in Medicine. And we have some exciting news because our book is in production. It's a book that will contain all of the installments in the series and also a discussion chapter that I wrote with Anna Cianciolo in which we try to tie everything together. So that's coming out in August and I will let you know once it's out. So I'm here with Anna MacLeod, Victoria Long, and my co-host Gabrielle Veen. And Anna MacLeod is Professor and Director of Education Research in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. She is also the unit head for Dalhousie's Research in Medicine program. Victoria Long is a PhD student and research associate in the Department of Continuing Professional Development at Dalhousie University. And I asked Professor Gabrielle Veen to do the interview, and Gabrielle is the Vice Dean for Teaching, Learning and Students for the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health. She is Professor of Medical Education in the School of Medical Sciences. And I also co-edited a book with Gabrielle and Megan Brown, which is called Applied Philosophy for Health Professions Education. We're with a transatlantic crowd here, Gabs from the Gabrielle Veen from the UK, and Victoria Long and Anna MacLeod from Canada. Yeah, so Victoria, why don't we start with you? Can you say a little bit about yourself and what is the paper about in a nutshell?
Sure. So my name is Victoria Long, like you said. I started working for Anna a few years ago, and this was the first project that I was assigned on. So I work as a research associate at Dalhousie University. And what really interested me in this paper specifically was really drawing out the entire life cycle. So oftentimes we will, when we do research on cadavers, it'll be, how do people work on cadavers, or specifically what is the use of this cadaver, or what's the effectiveness of this cadaver. But really what drew me to this project, and probably you as well, Anna, was the fact that we could really follow the cadaver from even speaking to the donors before it really became a cadaver to when it is finally returned to the ground. So that's really what drew me to this project specifically.
Anna, this is a topic I don't know anything about, and it's just so fascinating. But can you just explain a little bit what the paper is about? Because it is about working with cadavers, but how did you approach that? And maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm Anna MacLeod. I'm a social scientist and a professor at Dalhousie Medical School. And like you, I knew absolutely nothing about this work before we started. I had never, other than at a funeral, I'd never actually seen a cadaver before we started this work. So it was really a fascinating piece of project for someone like me, a social scientist, to take on. And to be honest with you, this was not one of those projects that I conceptualized on my own necessarily. I was on vacation with my family and I got an email from the dean of our medical school saying, Anna, I would like to speak with you about an opportunity. And I thought, I wasn't sure, is this a good opportunity or not? But it was a little nerve-wracking. But when I went in to sit and chat with him, he highlighted the fact that we had this really interesting program, the clinical cadaver program that we describe in the paper. And he said, we hear anecdotally all the time that people find this such an incredibly valuable resource, that we have these cadavers that are preserved in such a way that they actually feel and behave to some degree like an anesthetized patient. So we keep hearing that it's really powerful, and but it's a program. It takes resources, it takes time and money and energy to run, and we're interested in learning more about whether it's viable. And I don't know, maybe he imagined that we would do some sort of comparative study between traditionally preserved cadavers and these clinical cadavers or that sort of thing. But we're Victoria and I were, and lots of our team members were very much in the kind of social science-y space, where theoretically oriented work, that sort of thing. So the work that we came up with was probably really different than what they had initially imagined we might do. Anyway, through that conversation, we found ourselves invited into these spaces, what we've referred to as the underworld of medical education in some ways, that we probably would not have had access to otherwise. And it's really interesting to think about that, the fact that there are these people, these projects, this work that happens that is very much, I don't want to say hidden from the rest of the medical school community, but it certainly happens off stage. So it was a real privilege to find ourselves meeting these people, entering their workspaces, learning about what they do, and actually getting to be there to not only to observe it, but to also experience it. So it was a really wonderful project, I have to say. I can't think of another bit of work that I've done lately that has really impacted me in the same way that this work has.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this as well. It's such a fascinating topic. And of course, everything to do with death and mortality is also very philosophically interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but one of the things I love about doing this podcast is that I get to invite actual experts to do most of the interview. And Gabs, we know each other from another book about philosophy that we co-edited together with Megan Brown. You are much more knowledgeable about this topic. And could you maybe introduce yourself and say how you connect to this paper?
Absolutely. So I'm Gabrielle Finn. I'm a professor of medical education and Vice Dean for the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health at the University of Manchester. I started life as an anatomist. I call myself a closet anatomist these days. So my anatomy is limited to doing workshops and things for the public on trying to bring surface anatomy and living anatomy back into public consumption and anatomy education, I guess. I do a lot of research on anatomy pedagogy, so I loved this paper and found it extremely interesting. And there is so much just from your brief introductions that I already want to unpack. So I think this is going to be an exciting conversation.
Yeah, go ahead and unpack.
Well, where to start? I think actually, you gave us some great background on how the study came about from your dean. And I was really struck by the fact that you mentioned this was the first time you'd seen a cadaver, Anna. I don't know about Victoria. So maybe even just explain to people what that was like as a person, when you're faced with your own mortality and as a researcher.
I actually have a medical background, so I went to medical school and I saw a cadaver as a medical student. But I will say that the cadavers that we work with, we have the privilege of working with at Dalhousie, it's very incomparable, the amount of realism. They really, when you walk into the room, they really look like sleeping patients versus the traditional cadavers that we work with. It's a lot easier to disconnect from the fact that it was a person because of how different it looks. But I will say the first time I saw a cadaver at Dalhousie, we call them the clinical grade cadavers. It was definitely shocking. And also, I remember specifically when I walked into the room where there were multiple cadavers, that was particularly shocking as well. It wasn't just face to face with a cadaver, but with a room full of cadavers. That is particularly striking as well. But there's definitely something surreal about it. And I hope that's something we captured in the paper as well, where there's something so surreal about encountering this being that is somewhere between life and death, and grappling with your own mortality through that. And normally we work with living patients, and in medical school, we work with books and pictures, but we don't have these moments where we're really facing death right in front of us. So that was, for me anyways, that was definitely a unique experience.
it was one of those moments I had to sort of psych myself up for it the moment I knew I was going in. So my first encounter was at a continuing professional development seminar that was being run using the cadavers. It was an airway management course, and people come to take the course at Dalhousie Medical School. And it's run by our colleague and our partner in this research, Dr. George Kovacs. And and George is a wonderful guy, such a supporter of our work, appreciates our social science ethnographic orientation so much, and facilitated so much of this work. It was a great collaboration. But he's an emergency doctor and is used to working like fast under pressure, that sort of thing. And so I remember showing up that morning and him just sort of saying, okay, go, come on into the room, and trying to be like, okay, I'm cool with this. I'm okay with this. I'll be fine. And I, you are fine in the moment, but it certainly triggered a lot of thinking for me in a way that no other research project that I've done has. And so, I think I know I've told this story. It feels like I tell the story all the time, but I think it really captures the reaction to it. I went home, and not too long afterwards, I cut off all my hair. I used to have all kinds of really long hair. And at the time I was thinking, looking around the room, and you can't help but think about what bodies are when you're in a room of bodies that aren't living anymore, and what it is at the end of our lives that our bodies do, what they are. And so I found myself thinking a lot about how I wanted to spend the time that I have and what my body was all about. And I kept thinking, like, I spend a lot of time washing and drying my hair. I don't think I really want to do that anymore. And, like those sorts, it was a very, very kind of visceral and personal reaction. And interestingly, like when we have written about this work, for the paper we're discussing today and in other places, the reflexivity piece is really interesting to try to write about. And we've had feedback, like you seem to want to talk about your feelings a lot, but it was a very emotional process for us. Some of us, so we were quite a diverse research team. Some of us, like Victoria, our MDs, have that background and have spent some time, but many of us, it was a first. And so it was an interesting group of people to bring together to really think through what we were seeing and what we were experiencing.
You mentioned in your introduction that the idea that you might compare traditional with your clinical grade cadavers, or what you refer to in the papers as the cadaver-based simulation. And I think just in terms of grounding the conversation, it's quite interesting just to explore what that means to people who are not working in the field of anatomy. Traditional, I would imagine you are meaning formalin, formaldehyde, fully fixed, fairly immovable cadavers. And then here we're referring with these clinical grade cadavers, you're talking about soft fix teal embalming, which was pioneered in Dundee in Scotland, and it gives that soft, more movable and slightly more lifelike presentation of a cadaver. You can move them, you can separate the planes, and the tissue is just softer and more manipulatable. But I guess it's just to really clarify for people what you were referring to in that space.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly the difference. And, one of the things that was really interesting for us to explore is many of the people who work in the program, who work in the actual, they're called, I think I'm getting this right, Victoria, cadaver technicians, who actually work to do the preservation work, are trained as funeral directors and formally trained in embalming. And so it was really interesting. Just by coincidence, before we took up this research project, we'd been doing a socio-material study of simulation, with looking at the tools of simulation. So mannequins and task trainers, and even simulated patients to some degree, to think about how the materiality of those things influence the way that people engage in simulation. And so what we saw was, there was something about the mannequins, the sort of, the expressions on their face or whatever that inspired a certain kind of behavior. People would be jokey, or sometimes they would, animate the mannequins and use a funny voice to fill in backstories, those sorts of things. The materiality of those tools inspired a particular type of behavior in the simulation space. So I think coming directly really from that work into the looking at procedural skills teaching and simulation with these clinical cadavers, as we call them, couldn't help but compare how the behavior in the room was quite different. And we think it was, our theory, our analysis was that had to do with the cadaver itself as being the basis of the simulation. And so a lot of the conversations that we had with people, or the things that we would see people doing, involved the cadaver technicians or working with clinicians to build a better simulator in some ways, right? Like so there would be conversations between physicians and the people in the program saying, in real life, a patient would do this if we performed this procedure or whatever. Is there any way that we can work with the cadaver to make it do that? So there was this really interesting collaboration between clinicians and people who worked in the program to try and build an excellent simulator to some degree. And there was a lot of pride about how they were contributing to an excellent educational experience.
I guess for me, it's that word simulation that sort of doesn't quite resonate with my experience in UK anatomy education. Traditional cadavers are formalin fixed, are used for gross anatomy. So for teaching through dissection or prosection, where the parts have already been pre-dissected for students and they're looking at things in isolation, so maybe only a lower limb as opposed to an entire cadaver. And that what you're speaking about in terms of cadaver-based simulation is just seen as anatomy and procedural CPD with cadavers rather than using the word simulation. And I guess it already gets me thinking about the transitions that you've so beautifully articulated in your paper about when a cadaver is a person, becomes a resource, or in this reference, it's almost become a mannequin, haven't they? They're taking the place of a high fidelity simulator. And yeah, that's a bit that kind of, it really stuck with me, thinking actually, maybe I feel a little uneasy with that reference. But that just comes from my own experience about, when does a body become a thing?
It is complicated for sure. And we see it in the language that people use, some of this complexity. I don't necessarily know that some of the people who work in the program would be comfortable with calling a cadaver a simulator either. And yet it is sort of what we're observing happening with them. I mean, there was definitely resistance to using the word tool, like a teaching tool. It's very complicated. I mean, you see it in the different pronouns and the different words that slip into people's language. Is it a he, a she, an it, a they, those sorts of things? It's complicated.
It really is. I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of, I don't think in anatomy education or even science, medicine in general, our lexicon has evolved enough to keep pace with the changes in the way that we teach or the issues that are happening in society. Pronouns and how a cadaver may have identified in life, for example. There's lots of assumptions that we have to make. The debate about sex and gender and things being in binary opposition, we haven't kept pace. And maybe because we're talking about death, it just stagnates all those conversations and it makes it quite difficult to unpack.
I think in the fact that calling it a simulation, a simulator or a thing makes us uncomfortable, I think on the one hand that adds to the success of Cadavers as a simulator, because it really shows that a lot of people, to a certain degree, will say they detach from the fact that this is a person to really be able to practice. But I think fundamentally, we all really still see it as a person, and we really want to pay respect. And we still have this sense of the sanctity of the human body, and those elements of the humanist that always permeated those interactions with it. That is actually the thing that really enhanced that experience. And just going off of some of the things you talked about, Anna, with the experience being very different, I can think of an example. So one of the times when I was doing an observation of the cadaver work, it's in this simulation suite where there's this glass wall, and it has 2 areas where you can practice. So in one area, there was a cadaver and people were practicing on the cadaver. And in the other area, they put a mannequin there for people to practice. And they were kind of going in and out. But I remember standing there and looking at the people in the cadaver room who were very serious, practicing, not really talking about anything other than the cadaver, the procedure, the anatomy. And then looking over my shoulder at the mannequin, and they were all laughing and joking. And even at one point, there was this student who was sort of laughing with his colleagues in the other room. And he walked into the room, and as soon as he stepped past the glass doors, his face just went, like he was smiling, and the smile was completely gone, because there's this recognition of, no, this is a serious moment. And I think, as we talked about, that really characterized for us what cadaver work meant.
It's interesting that partly in your reflexivity section, but you talk about the underworld, and that really does resonate. The fact that, anatomists and dissection facilities are typically underground or on the top floor of a building, completely blocked out with all natural light obscured. And I just, I guess from a philosophical perspective, and just, we're perpetuating that taboo of death again, that it's what we do is, I don't want to say immoral or wrong or should be hidden, that it's, you mentioned things being secretive, that, that the underbelly of the university. So I just wondered, what that was like for you, and applaud you for, having so much reflexivity in your research, because I think that's something we don't always see.
It is striking, when you find yourself entering those spaces, that it's funny that I grew up not too far from the medical school I work in, about a 4-hour drive from here. Here in Canada, we talk about things in terms of hours instead of kilometers. I don't know why, but we do. So I remember coming to visit Halifax, where we live now, as a 13, 14-year-old, and my uncle driving me by the medical school and saying, look, this is where the bodies are. And oh, wow. It was one of those moments that stayed with me. And I couldn't help but think about that when I was doing this research, thinking, how now here I am entering these spaces in a different kind of capacity altogether. And what really stood out for us, I think, at least for me, was how committed and dedicated the people were who work in these programs to doing, to being excellent at their work. Truly, they were really, really committed. We talk about there being a discourse of excellent education that permeated all of this work. And it's very present in the spaces that we found ourselves in. So it was such a contrast to be in the underground, literally in the underground, where there is very little light, where there are things that I didn't know were present, in the medical school, like washing machines and a forklift and, those sorts of things, the physical tools that facilitate this work that, that I had no idea about before seeing them. And then talking with people who are really committed to excellence in education and to providing the best learning experience that they can, to making sure that donors' wishes are respected, And so it's a world of contrasts, but very much a world of pride and of good work. And we really wanted that to come through in this project, because it was, I think, one of the most striking things was how hard people work to give this excellent learning experience, and not just in a traditional sort of, building a good curriculum, building a good simulator kind of way, but there's a recognition that some of this is emotional work, that this is difficult work for people. And the people that we talked to, they were all in, and they saw it, they live it every day, and they really wanted to do the best possible work that they could. But it is very interesting, the physical spaces in which this work takes place. And Gabs, what you mentioned about it being underground or in the top floor, we have both of those spaces in our buildings here on the other side of the Atlantic. So I think it very much translates into different spaces. Been doing a bit of reading, and one of the concepts I'm really interested in lately that's helping me make sense of a lot of things in the broad field of medical education is the idea of work. And the sociology of work, and the fact that all of this, there are so many different types of work that we engage in. And one of the fields I read a little bit about in preparing to write some of this stuff up is the idea of dirty work. There's a whole field about people who do jobs that society in general find unpalatable. And death work, anything in that broad realm very much falls into that category. And the sort of societal aversion to death and dying and all of those things has very much permeated, I think, how we think and talk about this world.
Absolutely. I mean, my first my first job in a university while I was trying to get doctoral funding was as an anatomy aide. So that was below the technician, washing, preparing bodies, and it fascinated people. Everyone, there are war stories that even in general broad society seem to keep, rolling around, ideas that we all run around with hands and are playing pranks, and it's absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. That the pride in looking after somebody's loved one and the dignity that's preserved. And I think you did a really good job when you talk about the transitions of the cadaver in capturing that. It is difficult work, absolutely. And, Victoria, you said there's lots of coping strategies that people use in order to, I guess, protect themselves, because you are doing something that's difficult. You're working with bodies in various states. However, I think it's a real honor to do that, and I hope, I think that comes across in what you're saying. I think I'd really like to unpack some of your methods, because I think personally ethnographic stuff is fantastic. But maybe we could just wrap up on some of the kind of the framing of the paper and the cadaver side by just thinking about the hidden curriculum and all of that tacit and implied messaging, in the physical space, in the way that people talk or don't talk about cadavers, and the way that I feel we forget the different discourses and significance that the body has. We're quite happy to talk about cadavers in a very scientific, clinical way, and we're quite happy to acknowledge that they were a person and belonged to someone and a loved one, and that's the final transition that you describe in your paper. But we don't talk an awful lot about the symbolic and the aesthetic and the sexual discourses of the body. I think we've hinted at that with the different with pronouns and gender and sexuality, but that's all still very much taboo as well, isn't it? Like, when you're talking about looking at a cadaver and talking about somebody past tense, that we forget about all of the different meanings that this person or this cadaver had.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, one of the most interesting bits of information I found was when we interviewed the cadaver technicians who had been trained as funeral directors, and they talked about the sort of professional role strain that they had in moving from the funeral realm to this medical education realm, and how the work that they did is very different to prepare a cadaver for education. as opposed to preserving or preparing it for, for a memorial type of service. And, so there was a lot of emotional work that the technicians themselves were engaged in, but I'm not sure. I'm sure it's the same thing for you, Victoria. When you find yourself in those spaces and you look around, a lot of those markers of identity and the ways that we make sense of people, living people in the world, are gone because of the work that has happened to prepare the body for education. And so it's really hard to tell. Obviously the clothing is gone, but so too are, hair and jewelry, and it's the bodies are just very plain, and so you can't tell. Was this a rich person or a poor person, a parent, a partner, a professional? You just don't know. And in many cases, because most of our donors tend to be frail older people, even your initial judgment about whether this person lived as a man or a woman, all of those things are gone, and it is disorienting. The tools that we use in everyday life to make sense, to sort and sift people into those categories are not, they're just not there. And it does make you realize how deeply embedded some of those processes of sorting and sifting people socially are in your everyday. And when the markers are gone, it changes things. So it also, again, from a reflexivity perspective, really made me pause to think about my own sort of physical being, my own body, and what matters to me, again, I talked about my big haircut, but you couldn't help but reflect on what bodies are when you see them all reduced to the very most basic form, laying there. It's a very strange and impactful sight. I don't know, did that resonate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. It's a true leveler, isn't it? We all come into the world the same and we leave the world the same. And yeah. I think that's quite profound for lots of people, and perhaps different seeing a cadaver compared to a loved one, in that you do see them in that entirely vulnerable state that maybe you wouldn't encounter elsewhere. I know that I'd mentioned to Mario that I love the fact that this wasn't an empirical kind of, a positivist comparison of traditional versus soft fix cadavers, which is best for learning. I know Mario's got lots of thoughts on that.
Well, I was just thinking how my approach in medical education is interdisciplinary, from the perspective that the research tools that you use have to fit kind of the object of research. So I was thinking about how you speak, how profound it is to encounter a cadaver, and how much respect around that also translated into the method that you're using. And sometimes with a paper like this, I try to imagine, what if this study had been done by another study? So Victoria, you talked about this student walking into a room and changing kind of the facial expression, kind of being first cheerful and laughing with the mannequin, and then being face to face with the cadaver, something happened. So I guess you could, in a more traditional medical education research way, you could maybe formulate that in terms of attitudes towards the cadaver, and you could examine how the attitudes of medical students change, during this training, or you could measure it before and after. But instead, in your paper, you talk about being, and you talk about ontological change, and you talk about transitions of the cadaver, while the cadaver materially remains the same, but still you talk about changes. So could you speak a little bit about what makes this at the level of being and ontology, rather than just, let's say, students' attitudes changing towards the cadaver during their learning process?
I think you bring a really important point to the conversation. I think a lot of the conversations we have been having around cadaver work or simulation work has been around fidelity. And it's been around physical and functional fidelity, where physical is, does it resemble a human body, and functional fidelity in terms of, does it respond to manipulation in the same way as a normal human body would. And those are really our two frameworks for understanding, measuring, is this a good representation? Is this a good simulation of real life? But what we found in our research is that there may be something missing in that. There may be something missing in the fact that this is a human body. So in the ontological fidelity of the human body, because really, I think the advancements in technology and having these really high-tech mannequins is excellent. But as we see, the most technologically advanced mannequin we will ever produce will not reproduce that humanity of the cadaver, which really affected every simulation. And so what we're offering in this paper is maybe we need to look beyond physical and functional fidelity, or the ways we usually see fidelity, and draw on a philosophical perspective to understand maybe there is something to be said about another type of fidelity, which could be ontological fidelity, or the idea of what this is.
I found one of the things that, from a methodological perspective, that really we needed to do was to build in lots of time to honestly to just chat, to just discuss what we had seen. Because the things that Victoria is describing, the complexity of it all, we were seeing it and we're living it. But it was through our kind of collective conversations with our multiple perspectives that we were able to make sense of what those missing pieces were, and where we could direct our findings and our inquiry and our findings, so that we were able to offer something that wasn't already there. So, I think one of the real strengths of our project was that we had people like Victoria with a medical background, people who were really comfortable and at ease being around the clinical cadavers. Two of our team members, George Kovacs and Lucy Patrick, are emergency physicians who work in the clinical cadaver program. And then we had a whole bunch of social sciencey people with backgrounds in education or in critical studies and those sorts of things, who and some with training in ethnography, who when we all came together, we helped each other sort of see our assumptions and our blind spots. And so there was something to be said for having the space for conversations and having the multiple perspectives come together to unpack this really complex set of sites.
It's really tricky, particularly in the UK, to get ethnographic studies approved. Even if observing, obviously, you're observing real live people, but you're also observing really, people who were alive and are now dead in the underworld, quote, of the university. So I just wonder, how you landed on ethnographic observation and how you were able to get that approved. Did you have any challenges with it as a method?
Yeah, it's not the most straightforward way to collect data, that's for sure. And yet it is what I love to do. And I do think that for those of us who are sort of embedded in the educational work of a medical school, we're kind of informally doing ethnography every day. And I think that that's an important piece to think about. We live and work in these places. Well, we don't live there, but maybe sometimes it feels like we live there. But we know these places so well that it's really, it counts for something, our sort of semi-insider knowledge of the way that places work. But in order to get the ethical approval to do long-term observational work, it's tricky for sure. So in this case, we were not able to take photographs or videos of the space, that sort of thing. And so we relied on really traditional, old school notebooks. We took notebooks and pens into the spaces and we took notes, and we had designed sort of an ethnographic template for things to pay attention to. But in reality, what we did was we went in, and things that caught our attention, we documented by field notes, and then we made sure that we took the time to unpack, to discuss, as I was just saying. But it's not, it wasn't efficient, I guess is the way I would say it. Like it takes time, and we had to work to build relationships with people. We had to meet people to gain their trust so that they would invite us into our space. It's not like we can just say, yeah, I'm going to show up at your cadaver lab and hang out. We had to meet people and be invited into those spaces, describe what we wanted to do, and help them understand why we wanted to do it. So it evolved over time, where we were gradually invited into more spaces and connected with more people and those sorts of things. So I guess there are a couple of pieces there. The ethical piece, it wasn't simple, but it was doable, provided that we paid attention to not collecting data that we shouldn't have collected, that we didn't have permission to collect. And we had to sort of make calls about when we required informed consent for observations and those sorts of things as well. And we did that as these situations were unfolding. So in the end, though, despite those complexities, the ethical complexities, and the fact that it is not quick work, the depth and the richness and the connections that we were able to build, and it is very much an iterative process. You get to know people, and it grows from there. It did allow, I think, for a certain degree of comfort and trust to be established between us and the people who were part of the field that we were observing.
You've talked about conversation a lot, and challenging each other to think about your biases and your assumptions. Table 1 in your paper beautifully delineates the 6 stages of the life cycle of your clinical cadavers, and I just wonder how that came into being with so many different viewpoints, and whether you got, is it something that you easily reached a quote consensus, on? For me, I'd never really thought of that transition between a cadaver to an educational cadaver. The idea of a teacher, or in anatomy, we talk a lot about the silent teacher. That certainly matches my experience, but that transition from cadaver to educational cadaver is not something I'd ever really thought about. So I'm just curious as to how that developed, and what you maybe think the take home is for people working in this space when you've mapped out those transitions.
Victoria did a lot of work on this life cycle, if you want to talk to that.
Yeah, no, when you were talking, I was just picturing, so in our office, when all our offices were together, we had this really big poster in there, and we just had Post-its, and we just, throughout the time we were working on it, we just move around these Post-its we'd have the life cycle and the different body, person, and all this terminology, and we just work through it. So we have, this table isn't in the paper, but we have, so all of the different names for the cadaver, and then we'd have all of the different people involved and all of the different steps, everything that was done to the cadaver, everything that's done, that the cadaver does to us, that sort of thing, and mapping all of those events, all those peoples, and all those interconnections, which really became the heart of the analysis at a certain degree. And I think when you were talking about that difference between cadaver and cadaver work, I think, or the educational cadaver, I think that came from the fact that we were looking at things in this as a whole, and in function of the people that were involved and the steps that were involved and the things that were done to the cadaver. So those differences were not only sort of conceptual in a way that was removed from the flow of the life cycle of the cadaver, but it was it was really derived from that sense of what was happening throughout the life cycle. So I would say those that's how the decisions were made at that point. But I will say as well, as we say in the paper, these transitions are obviously not fixed. When a person becomes a donor, they obviously are still a person when they're a donor, and we're not necessarily trying to say that this is what it's now and this is what it's now and it's no longer this. And it's really this flow of ideas and this flow of conceptions of what a cadaver is and how things change over time, rather than a fixed state at different periods of the life cycle.
When you look at how you've mapped it out around, where these transitions are taking place, the people, the activities, and the location, and I think Anna mentioned this earlier, the impact of physical space, and that's something that I took from your paper is actually, the impact of time and space on how we perceive a person, whether that cadaver is within a prep room or then in a simulation space, is changing the lens through which people view the same body. And that for me was really quite impactful.
And I think the concept of work comes in here again too, in that the physical space changes the work that people are doing, depending on where the cadaver is physically located. It really did change the interactions along the way. It was such being in those spaces again, that spaces that we didn't know existed, was a real privilege. And I think we asked ourselves, one of the questions we asked ourselves along the way throughout this work was, and it was really quite it started out sort of jokey, but we became very serious about it, is would you donate your body then when the time came? And it's interesting how, depending on where we were in this life cycle, our responses changed, from where we're thinking about it. And the only time I myself felt strongly compelled that, maybe I would, was during the last stage, the sort of teacher becoming a legacy, or the loved one, in the interment and memorial service. You find yourself in this large church space where people come together to. It's interesting too. The memorial service takes place in a church, but it's not necessarily a religious ceremony. It's a big space with free parking. So that's why we have the service in that particular space. But nonetheless, there is such hard to describe, but a feeling of gratitude, of honor. And I remember one particular instance where, the person speaking started off by saying, if your family member is someone who are honoring, please stand up. Or if you're a learner who's worked with these cadavers, and before we knew it, everyone in the space was sort of standing up and saying, we've all been touched by the gift that your loved one offered in sharing their body with the human body donation program and with education. And it was just the most profound and great feeling of gratefulness. And so the physical space and the activities that people were engaged in really sort of changed the way that even we ourselves as researchers thought about what our own bodies and whether we might donate.
I think we could continue speaking about this for hours. It's such a rich and interesting topic. We have just a few minutes though, and there's two questions I really like to ask. So the first one is kind of out of self-interest, because I'm involved in a project about emergency care simulation. Mm-hmm. No cadavers, but just the only thing in common is that you're trying to prepare students for something. And the discussion is also a lot about realism. So from your paper, I get the sense that realism, or fidelity, as you call it, it's not the only thing that counts. And I wonder if you could say something about what do you mean by ontological fidelity? And is that a concept that could also translate to other types of simulation in medical education?
I think it's an important concept. In fact, Victoria and I are just bouncing a draft of a paper about why ontological fidelity matters back and forth at the moment. I think really at the core, what we mean by ontological fidelity, and jump in anytime, Victoria, but is the idea that there's something about realness that can't be replaced. And so, you'll see in simulation spaces that people take the time to write backstories for the mannequins, or they give the mannequin a name, they try to humanize it. And we spend a lot of time and effort on that. And I think it's important to do that, but it's not real in the same way that, you don't have to do that with a cadaver, because we know there's a story there. I don't think we necessarily need to know what it is. It can't be removed. The fact that there was life, that there was a living person who existed in the world, that sort of thing. And so, we're working on thinking about how ontological fidelity might be integrated into various forms of curriculum, and the idea being here that there are enough real stories, real perspectives, real people in the world that we can, in fact, provide that ontological fidelity in various forms of curriculum.
That's a nice segue to the last question I want to ask, because Deleuze and Guattari, they write in their book, What is Philosophy? They write that philosophy is about the creation of concepts. So this is one of those concepts that you create or that you form. And well, Deleuze is, I think, more and more known in research as well, but there's also often, I would say, a question of fidelity, because the work is used in different ways. And when people use the work of Deleuze, they usually use something about the rhizome. So I was really pleasantly surprised to see What is Philosophy used in an actual empirical paper. How did that happen?
Oh, well, that happened purely by accident, I would say, in that I had some time because I was on sabbatical, and it was during the pandemic. I was supposed to be in Australia, and instead I was in my basement. And I had time to walk and think, and I was on a winter walk listening to a podcast, actually, Mary, I've heard you recommend this podcast before, the Philosophize This.
Yeah, by Stephen West. Yeah, exactly. Everybody listen to it. It's brilliant.
It's fantastic. Absolutely. And I had been listening to a series of them, and one day I was walking, and the episode about what is philosophy came on. And I remember very clearly he gives the example of the fact that humans have sort of three fundamental activities: art, science, and philosophy. And so when I was thinking about it in terms of cadaver work, the art piece was clear enough. When we prepare bodies so that they look a certain way. The scientific, the acts involved with preservation and teaching clinical skills and those sorts of things. But I thought, we haven't really thought about the philosophical work that's happening, the concepts that are being created. So I returned back and then did some reading, and Victoria and I sat in our office and listened together and worked through some of the ideas. And it just became a clear fit as a really strong lens to help us make sense of some of the ideas.
Gabs, do you have any final thoughts? Why should people read this paper if they haven't already?
I think this paper it's fantastic. It's so powerful in the way that you delineate a really tricky, complex, personal, but special life cycle of a cadaver. I love the fact that this paper uses ethnography, and it's not ramming a positivist viewpoint down our throats. So it's really easy to happen in medical education research. I think it's really important for not just researchers, but for people, anyone who might be thinking about anatomy and death and dying, just to be mindful and aware that we are so respectful of cadavers as well. I think it's quite easy when we're talking about anatomy for it to become sensationalized very easily. And I hope that even if people aren't thinking about this paper from a philosophical perspective or the fantastic use of methods, that they also think about, the gift that the donors have given us. And I think you've done a wonderful job in highlighting that to people. So thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything you would like to add?
It was a pleasure and an honor to be asked. And I just want to say briefly how much we appreciate everyone who contributed on our research team, who are all listed as authors on the papers, and the people who invited us into their spaces and shared their work and thoughts with us.
Yes, I second that. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us, and it's been really great.